I could barely contain my excitement as I stared at the letter in my hands. Finally, after all this waiting, 2 long years, everything was ready. The paperwork allowing me and my daughters to move to Canada and be with Brian was complete. I glanced at Sheila and Bea, playing with their toys on the floor, blissfully unaware of the life-changing news I was about to share with their father. I grabbed my phone and dialed Brian, a wide smile spreading across my face. I couldn't wait to see his reaction. All those lonely nights, the endless video calls where we promised each other that it would just be a little longer, it was finally over. The phone rang twice before the screen flickered to life. But instead of seeing Brian's familiar face, there was a woman staring back at me. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" she said, squinting at the camera. I blinked, confused. Is Brian there?" The woman paused, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. "He's in the shower. Who are you?" I froze. The room felt like it was spinning around me. Who was she? And why was she answering Brian's phone? "I'm his wife," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Who are you?" Her smirk faltered. "Maya," she said, her voice suddenly guarded. I didn't know Brian was married. I felt a rush of nausea hit me, my stomach churning violently. The happiness I had felt just minutes ago was replaced by a heavy, suffocating weight in my chest. I couldn't speak. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, staring at the screen as if it could somehow explain everything. Wife. I had said the word with so much pride, but now it felt hollow, meaningless. The plane ride to Canada was a blur. I barely remembered packing or dropping Sheila and Bea off at my parents' house. I only remembered the anger burning inside me, the betrayal, and the need to confront Brian face to face. I arrived at his office unannounced, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. I marched through the doors, the receptionist's voice trying to stop me falling on deaf ears. I had one mission: find Brian. I stormed into his office where he was sitting casually typing away at his computer. He looked up, startled. "Sharon?" His voice cracked in surprise. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer him right away. I couldn't. I was too busy looking around the room, half expecting to see her, the one who had answered his phone, the one who had been in his apartment, the one who was sharing my husband. "Where is she?" I spat, my voice trembling with fury. Brian blinked. What? What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me, Brian." My voice rose as I stepped closer to him, hands clenched into fists. "Maya, I called you." She answered the phone. His face paled, and I saw it. The guilt, the panic. He opened his mouth to say something, but I didn't let him speak. "You've been cheating on me," I said, each word like venom on my tongue. "For how long?" He didn't deny it. He just stood there looking at me with that same blank, pathetic expression. My heart broke all over again. 5 years of marriage, our daughters, the future we had been waiting to start. It all crumbled in that moment. "Sharon," he began, stepping toward me. "Don't!" I screamed, cutting him off. "Don't you dare touch me! How could you do this to me? To us? To our girls?" The door behind me opened and I spun around. There she was, Maya. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and she turned to Brian, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "Maya," I said coldly, "you have 5 seconds to leave or I'll make sure you never work in this city again." She looked at Brian, but he said nothing, still frozen in place. Without another word, Maya turned and bolted out of the office. I turned back to Brian, the silence between us heavy and unbearable. "You have to choose," I said, my voice low and shaky but firm. "Me and the girls, or her?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was a mixture of confusion and guilt. He couldn't even say the words I needed to hear. I swallowed hard, feeling my heart shatter again. "You don't even know what you want, do you?" When he didn't answer, I made my decision. "I'll make it easier for you," I whispered. "I'm done. I'm filing for divorce, and you'll never see me or our daughters again." The drive back from Canada was long, and I cried more tears than I thought I had in me. But by the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, a new determination had set in. I had 2 daughters to think about. Brian wasn't going to break me. After filing for divorce, I sold the house and packed up our lives, moving to my grandma's old house in the quiet town of Pine Ridge, Illinois. It was remote, far from everything and everyone, but that's exactly what I needed, a fresh start. I used the money from the house sale to open a small diner in town. Peter, my cousin and the best cook I knew, agreed to help me run it. Business was slow at first, but as the weeks passed, word spread, and we started seeing more customers, especially during tourist season. It was hard work, but it was mine, and it kept me focused on the future. The pain was still there, of course. Every time I looked at Sheila and Bia, I felt the weight of what Brian had done, but I pushed through it. I had to. For them. 5 months had passed when Brian showed up at my doorstep. I had just finished cleaning up the diner when I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. There he was, standing on the porch with that same lost expression. "Sharon," he said softly, "can we talk?" I crossed my arms over my chest, my heart racing. "What do you want, Brian?" "I've been looking for you," he said, stepping closer. "Maya and we're over. I left my job in Canada. I just want to come home." Home. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. "This isn't your home anymore, Brian," I said, my voice colder than I felt. "You made your choice." "I made a mistake, Sharon," he pleaded. "Please, just give me a chance to make it right. For the girls. For us." I shook my head, trying to keep the walls around my heart intact. "You don't get to walk back into our lives like nothing happened. You don't get to hurt me and then act like you can fix it with an apology." Brian sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know I messed up, but I love you, Sharon. I love our girls. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." For a moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man I had married, but I couldn't forget what he had done. The betrayal, the lies. "You can see the girls," I said after a long pause. "But that's it. I'll never forgive you for what you did, Brian." He nodded, defeated. "I understand." As he walked away, I felt the tears welling up again. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to forgive him. But the scars ran too deep, and I wasn't sure I could ever heal. Brian was back, but it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. He rented a house just a few blocks away from where the girls and I lived with my grandma, and every time I saw him, it was a reminder of everything he had shattered. The girls were thrilled, though. Sheila would squeal in delight whenever Brian picked her up, and Bia had become his little shadow, following him around with her tiny footsteps, her laugh echoing in the house. Watching them bond again was bittersweet. It should have made me happy. But all it did was remind me of how easily he had walked out on us, how easily he had lied. It was strange seeing him slip into the role of father again, as if nothing had happened. Every time he'd come by to spend time with the girls, I'd stay in the background, arms crossed, watching. He would glance at me now and then, his eyes full of regret, and something else. Hope, maybe? But I kept my distance, refusing to engage with him beyond the necessary discussions about Sheila and Bia. "Sharon, I was thinking about taking the girls to the park this afternoon," Brian said one morning as he stood in the doorway, his eyes hopeful. I kept my voice cool and businesslike. "That's fine. Be back before dinner." He hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for me to say more, but I didn't. I turned away, busying myself with the stack of bills on the table. "Okay," he muttered and left with the girls in tow, their laughter fading as the door shut behind them. Every time he left with them, a small part of me ached. I wanted to be the one laughing with my daughters, the one holding Brian's hand as we took them to the park, like we had imagined when we talked about our future before he left for Canada. But that future was gone, and I couldn't let myself forget it. Over the next few weeks, Brian became a fixture in our lives. He showed up every day, spending hours with Sheila and Bia, helping them with their puzzles, pushing them on the swings, and reading bedtime stories when they stayed with him. He was trying. I could see that. But I wasn't ready to let him back in. I stood at the kitchen sink one afternoon, watching him in the backyard with the girls. Sheila was on his shoulders, her little arms wrapped around his neck, and Bia was twirling in circles, giggling. It was a picture of everything I had wanted for our family, only now it felt like an illusion, something I couldn't touch without getting hurt. I sighed, wiping my hands on a towel, when my cousin Peter came into the kitchen, shaking his head. "You're doing that thing again," he said, leaning against the counter. "What thing?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "That thing where you stare at Brian like you're mad, but really you're hurting," Peter said, his voice soft. "Sharon, I know you still love him." I turned to him, my chest tightening. "Love him? How could I still love him after everything he did?" Peter shrugged. Love doesn't always disappear just because someone hurt you. It lingers, whether you want it to or not. I stared down at the counter, fighting the lump in my throat. Even if I do still love him, I can't trust him, Peter. He lied to me, cheated on me. How can I ever believe anything he says again? Peter didn't respond immediately, but his silence was heavy with understanding. I'm not saying you should take him back, he finally said. But maybe you should let yourself feel what you're really feeling instead of burying it under all that anger. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. I can't. I'm not going to let him hurt me again. Peter gave me a sad smile and left me alone in the kitchen, but his words stayed with me long after he was gone. One evening, after Brian dropped the girls off and was about to leave, Sheila tugged on my sleeve, her big eyes wide with curiosity. "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy stay for dinner anymore?" she asked, her voice innocent and sweet. I knelt down beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Daddy has his own house now, sweetheart. He'll eat there." Sheila's brow furrowed. "But I want him to stay here. Can he stay, please?" Her request caught me off guard. I glanced at Brian, who stood by the door, his face hopeful yet cautious, waiting for my answer. I sighed, not wanting to disappoint my daughter. "Okay, just for tonight," I said, forcing a small smile. Sheila's face lit up, and she ran to tell Bea the news. Brian's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw gratitude flicker in them. "Thank you," he said softly. I nodded stiffly, refusing to let my guard down. "It's just dinner. Don't read into it." The meal was awkward at first, the tension between us palpable, but as the evening wore on, I found myself relaxing, just a little. Brian was good with the girls, making them laugh, coaxing Bea to eat her vegetables by pretending the broccoli was a tiny tree for her to devour. I caught myself smiling more than once, though I quickly suppressed it when I realized he was watching me. After the girls were in bed, Brian lingered by the door, his hand resting on the knob. "I just want to say, Sharon, I know I have a long way to go, but I'm not giving up," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll keep showing up for you and the girls. I'm going to prove that you can trust me again, even if it takes the rest of my life." His words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I felt my defenses waver for a split second, but I quickly rebuilt them. "Good night, Brian," I said, my voice cold once again. "I'll see you tomorrow." He hesitated, searching my face for any sign of softness, but I gave him none. Finally, he nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind him. As I stood there in the silence of the house, I couldn't help but feel the smallest crack in the wall I had built around my heart. Brian was trying. He was showing up. But could I ever really let him back in? I didn't have the answer yet. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to tear those walls down. Not yet, but maybe someday. It was a slow night at the diner, and after the last customer left, I wiped down the counters in silence. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. Peter had already gone home, and the stillness of the place felt both comforting and heavy. It had been one of those days when exhaustion weighed on me, not just physically, but emotionally, too. The door creaked open, and I looked up to see Brian standing there, holding Sheila's forgotten stuffed bunny. "I thought Sheila might want this," he said, his voice soft. I nodded, taking it from him. "Thanks. She'd be devastated if she didn't have it for bedtime." He lingered by the door for a moment, his eyes searching mine, as if waiting for something. "Do you need help closing up?" I hesitated, but then shrugged. "If you want to." He walked in, rolling up his sleeves, and started stacking chairs onto tables. We worked in quiet rhythm, the awkwardness between us not as suffocating as it used to be. Maybe it was because we had fallen into a routine, me keeping my distance and him respecting it, though never too far away. Once the chairs were up, I leaned against the counter, too tired to fight the emotions bubbling under the surface. "The girls are doing well," I said quietly, my gaze fixed on the floor. "They're happy when they're with you." Brian stopped, standing across from me. "I'm glad. I've missed them so much, Sharon. I missed you too." His voice wavered on that last part, but I ignored it. "Don't make this about us," I said, crossing my arms over my chest, more out of defense than anger. "This is about the kids." "I know," he replied, and for once there was no pushback in his voice. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But sometimes I wish we could talk about us, even if it's just to get everything out in the open." I stiffened. There's nothing to talk about, Brian. You made your choices. I'm just trying to move on. He nodded slowly, his face etched with regret. I did make my choices, and they were the worst decisions of my life. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. Something in his voice, the rawness of it, tugged at the wall I'd built around my heart. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to let him in, not even a little bit. But the weight of carrying all that anger and pain alone was becoming too much. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said, my voice cracking despite my best effort to stay composed. I still love you, but I don't trust you. How could I? Brian looked at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I wouldn't blame you if you never forgave me. But I want you to know, Sharon, I've changed. I'm not the man who walked away. I'll wait as long as it takes for you to believe that, even if you never do. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and painful. I wanted to believe him, and that scared me more than anything. I turned away, blinking back my own tears. You say you've changed, but what happens when things get hard again? How do I know you won't just leave me and the girls like you did before? I won't, he said firmly, stepping closer but keeping enough distance not to make me feel trapped. I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I lost you. That's something I'll regret forever. But if you don't want me back, I'll accept that. I just want to be here for you and our daughters. If that means staying in the background and being your friend, then I'll do that. As long as it takes, Sharon. The sincerity in his voice broke something in me. All the anger and betrayal I had held onto so tightly felt like it was crumbling, piece by piece. But the fear of trusting him again, of opening myself up only to be hurt, kept me silent. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me. I don't know if I can do this, Brian. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I know, he said softly. I'm not asking you to trust me right now. Just let me show you. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. I turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time in months. His face was full of regret, but there was something else there too, determination. The man standing in front of me wasn't the same man who had lied and cheated. He had been broken too, in his own way. But was that enough? I'll think about it, I said, my voice barely audible. Brian smiled, a small, sad smile, but it was real. That's all I can ask for. He left quietly after that, the door closing behind him, and I stood there in the empty diner, feeling like the ice around my heart had begun to thaw, just a little. Maybe I wasn't ready to forgive. Maybe I wasn't ready to trust. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep shutting him out. And that terrified me more than anything. The days rolled into months, and slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible at first, I began to soften. It wasn't that the pain of Brian's betrayal disappeared. It was always there, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. But his dedication, his effort, and his unwavering presence were chipping away at the wall I had so carefully built around my heart. Brian was always there. He picked the girls up from school, helped Sheila with her reading, and carried Bea on his shoulders during our walks to the park. He showed up at the diner during the busy rush hours to lend a hand, and I would catch him glancing at me from across the room with a look that said everything we never talked about. He never pushed, never asked for more than I was willing to give, but he was present. And I noticed, I couldn't help but notice. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat on the porch of Grandma's old house watching the girls chase fireflies in the yard. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over everything, and Peter stepped out to join me, leaning against the porch railing. "Quiet night," he said, taking in the scene before us. I nodded, sipping my tea. "Yeah, the girls are having fun." Peter glanced at me with a knowing look, his eyes soft but probing. "You've been quiet lately, too, but not in a bad way." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I think you know what it means. You've been softer around Brian. You're letting him in." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Peter was right, and I hated how well he knew me. Instead, I sighed and leaned back in my chair. "He's different now," I admitted. "He's really trying, and I see that. But it doesn't make the past go away." "No," Peter agreed, "it doesn't. But you've got to ask yourself, how long are you willing to let the past dictate your future?" I blinked at him, surprised by his words. I'm just trying to protect myself, I said softly. I know, Peter said, his voice gentle. And you deserve to. But sometimes holding on too tightly to that hurt keeps you from moving forward. You still love him, Sharon. It's written all over your face when you look at him. I was silent for a long moment, watching Sheila laugh as Bea tried to catch a firefly that hovered just out of her reach. Did I still love him? Yes. That was never the question. But could I trust him? That was the part that kept me from stepping over the line I'd drawn between us. Peter gave me a knowing nod at my shoulder before heading back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I watched the sun dip lower, the warmth fading from the sky, and felt a quiet resolve building within me. I couldn't live like this forever, caught between the past and the possibility of a future I was too scared to face. Later that evening, after the girls had been tucked into bed and the house was quiet, I heard a soft knock on the door. When I opened it, Brian stood there, his expression hesitant. I didn't mean to bother you, he said, looking almost nervous, but I wanted to check in on the girls before I headed back. I stepped aside to let him in, and he quietly made his way to their bedroom, where I knew he'd kiss their foreheads and whisper good night. When he returned to the living room, he paused, glancing at me as if he was debating whether to say more. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, and motioned for him to sit. Brian, we need to talk. He sat down across from me, his eyes searching mine, waiting. I've been thinking, I began, unsure of how to even start. You've been doing everything right these past few months. You've been there for the girls, for me, and I see that. He nodded, his face serious but cautious, like he didn't want to push me. I still love you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I never stopped. But loving you doesn't mean I can just forget everything that happened. You broke something in me, Brian, something I don't know how to fix. I know, he said, his voice full of regret, and I'll never be able to take it back. But I swear to you, Sharon, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it, if you'll let me. I know I don't deserve your trust yet, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn it again, even if it means we just stay co-parents, friends, whatever you're comfortable with. Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened to him. For so long, I'd been waiting to hear these words. But the fear of being hurt again had kept me from opening myself up. Now, here he was, offering me the chance to rebuild, with no guarantees, just a promise to try. I don't want to live in the shadow of your betrayal forever, I whispered. I don't want that for me or for the girls. I want to move forward, but I need to know that you're not going to hurt us again. Brian reached across the table, taking my hand gently. I won't. I'll spend every day proving that to you. And if you can't trust me today, that's okay. But I'll be here, waiting, showing you I've changed. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. I'm willing to try, but on my terms. I need time, and I need to see that this is real. No more lies, Brian. No more lies, he promised, his eyes earnest and full of hope. We sat there for a moment, holding hands in the quiet of the living room. The road ahead wasn't clear, and the wounds weren't healed, but for the first time, I felt like there was a path forward, and maybe, just maybe, I was ready to walk it. A year had passed, and as I stood behind the counter of the diner, watching the lunchtime crowd shuffle in, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was good, better than I could have imagined a year ago. Brian was at the register, ringing up a group of tourists, flashing them that charming smile that I once fell in love with. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the faint tan he'd gotten from spending afternoons outside playing with Sheila and Bea. They were growing up so fast. Sheila was already 4, and Bea had just turned 3. They were happy, and I could see the difference it made having their father fully present in their lives again. Mommy, Bea's little voice called from the kitchen. I turned to see her toddling over to me with a messy apron on, flour smudged on her cheeks. What's going on, sweetie? I asked, crouching down to her level. Daddy said I can help make the cookies today, she said proudly, holding up a cookie cutter. I smiled and kissed her forehead. You're doing a great job. Let's go see how they're coming along. We walked into the kitchen, where Peter was barking out orders to the staff, while juggling the busy lunch rush. When he saw Bea, he grinned. "Here comes the real boss," he joked, giving her a high five. "She's been a big help today." "Of course she has," I said, feeling a warmth spread through me. This was our life now, simple, but full of the love and joy I hadn't dared to dream about a year ago. As Bea went back to helping with the cookies, I found myself watching Brian again. He moved easily through the crowd, chatting with customers, laughing with the staff, and always finding a moment to catch my eye and give me a smile. The hurt from his betrayal hadn't completely faded, but the trust we had worked so hard to rebuild had grown stronger, like the solid roots of a tree. After the rush died down, Brian joined me by the counter, his hand resting on the small of my back as we watched the last few customers linger over their desserts. "Tough crowd today," he teased, his eyes soft as he looked at me. "Tell me about it," I said with a grin. "But we survived." "We always do," he said, and there was a deeper meaning behind his words. We had faced so many storms, but we had learned how to weather them together. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, we sat out on the porch of Grandma's house, the crickets singing in the distance. The cool night breeze ruffled my hair, and I leaned into Brian's warmth as he wrapped an arm around me. "I was thinking today," I said quietly, "about how far we've come." He looked down at me, his expression thoughtful. "It hasn't been easy." "No, it hasn't," I agreed, "but I'm glad we didn't give up. I'm glad we kept trying." Brian squeezed my shoulder, his voice gentle. "I'm grateful every day that you gave me another chance. I know I didn't deserve it." I shook my head. "It's not about what you deserved, it's about what we've built since then. And I've seen how hard you've worked to rebuild this, to rebuild us. That means everything." We sat in silence for a while, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky. A year ago, I didn't think I could ever feel whole again. But now, sitting here with Brian, I realized that love wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, about choosing each other, day after day, even when things got hard. "I love you, Sharon," Brian said softly, his voice thick with emotion, more than I ever knew I could, "and I'll keep working every day to prove that to you." "I love you too," I whispered, my heart swelling with the truth of it. We're stronger now, not because we didn't break, but because we put the pieces back together. As the moon cast its silver light over the porch, I felt a deep sense of contentment. We still had our challenges, and there would be more to come, but I knew that we would face them together, honestly, patiently, and with the trust we had fought so hard to earn. And that, I realized, was the real meaning of love. Not the fairy tale, not the perfect story, but the effort, the commitment, and the willingness to rebuild. Together. The end. If you're enjoying the love stories here on True Hearts Presents, don't forget to subscribe. By subscribing, you'll never miss an update, and you'll be the first to know when we drop new romantic tales that will sweep you off your feet. Hit that notification bell, too, so you'll get alerted whenever we post fresh content. Let's keep this journey of love going together. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more heartfelt stories.